Hello YouTube and welcome back to Be a Loser. As we've discussed in previous videos, there are many benefits to eating an LCHF diet. And we've also seen that the standard American diet, the diet recommended by most nutritional experts, is a major cause of obesity and diabetes since it's very high in carbohydrates. So how did we ever start eating this way in the first place? How did we get to the point where doctors and dietitians are telling us to eat the very foods that make us fat and sick? Well, to do that, we're going to need a history lesson. The foods that make us fat make us crave the foods that make us fat. I'm paraphrasing Gary Taubes there from his book, Why We Get Fat. So the question he answers in the book is, what foods make us fat? Seems like a simple question, and before 1960 it had a simple answer. But since then, it's become quite distorted. Now, back in the 1800s, there was a man named William Banting. When he was a young man, he was normal weight, but as he grew older, he slowly gained weight. Not an enormous amount by any means, just a few pounds every year. By the time he was 62, he weighed 202 pounds. That's not an outrageous amount by today's standards, but he was considered quite overweight at the time. So, his physicians told him to eat less, but as we know, this just made him hungry and miserable. So he decided to exercise more by rowing. This, of course, got him into good physical condition, but he still could not lose the weight. So eventually, he started a new diet based on the advice of a French surgeon. So instead of restricting calories, he severely restricted carbohydrates, meaning sugars and starches, which we now call refined carbohydrates. Banting didn't eat breads, milk, beer, sweets, or potatoes. On this diet, he lost so much weight that he decided to publish it in Letter on Corpulence addressed to the public. This is considered to be the first diet book. Banting believed that it was not calories or overeating that was the problem, but refined carbohydrates that caused obesity. This line of thinking lasted for nearly a century, well past Banting's death. Sir William Osler, who wrote The Principles of Modern Medicine, and is considered by many to be the father of modern medicine, wrote that these refined carbs were the cause of obesity and should be treated with diets high in meat and eggs and low in these refined carbohydrates. He wrote that fatty foods were integral to reducing obesity, as these types of food generated satiety or a feeling of fullness. This was the prevailing thinking of doctors in the 1900s as well. In fact, if you fast forward to late 1963, Dr. Passmore wrote in the British Journal of Medicine that every woman knows that carbohydrate is fattening. It was just common knowledge. So, what changed? Well, in the 1950s, doctors felt that there was an increased incidence of heart disease. Now, there's much debate over whether or not this was actually true, and Gary Taubes discusses this greatly in his book. But because this was perceived as an epidemic, people began searching for the culprit. And very quickly, they started looking at dietary fat. In the 1960s, Dr. Ancel Keys, who was perceived as a nutritional expert and quite influential, began to popularize the diet-heart hypothesis. Using a great deal of influence and less than empirical data, he began demonizing dietary fat. But there was a problem. Dietary protein generally remains constant in human diets. It's actually quite difficult to raise the protein levels to more than 20 to 30% of calories eaten. So because of this, if you want to restrict fat, then you have to increase carbohydrates. And of course, the opposite is true as well. So you either get a low-fat, high-carb diet or a low-carb, high-fat diet. But because Dr. Keyes is villainizing dietary fat, his recommended heart-healthy diet is a high carbohydrate diet. Now, carbohydrates in the Western Hemisphere tend to be refined. So people began to eat more bread and pasta. Of course, not all experts agreed with this course. John Yudkin wrote a book titled Pure, White, and Deadly: How Sugar is Killing Us, in which he explains that it is refined carbohydrates that are the problem. Bear in mind that to this point in human history, a low-fat diet had never been tested in humans. There was no way of knowing what effect it would have on us. But as we are wont to do, and especially doctors and scientists, we believed we could create a diet better than the one we had been eating for millions of years. We moved away from natural fats such as cream, butter, and olive oil to refined carbs like bread and artificial oils like margarine. There was still plenty of debate, as we've seen, but low-fat diet supporters couldn't say that carbs were low-fat, which they considered good, and fattening, which is obviously bad, all at the same time. So in order to rationalize this away, they decided to say that carbohydrates were no longer fattening, but that instead it was calories that made us fat. There was little to no evidence to support this, but it was just generally assumed, mostly as an aspect of the first law of thermodynamics, which is discussed in my fasting series. Finally, in 1977, the debate was ended not by the scientific community, but by a politician. Senator George McGovern decided after meeting with journalists and scientists that dietary fat was to blame. This was, of course, a major break from tradition. No government agency prior to 1977 had ever mandated how we should eat. It was our mothers who did that. But after this ruling by McGovern, this new nutritional advice was taught in public schools. Pamphlets and charts were produced and distributed, and efforts were made to add carbohydrates to food in order to reduce the fat. So, formerly fattening foods became healthy. All carbs were fine as long as they were low in fat. Right. So if you wanted to lose weight, you wouldn't eat less bread, you'd eat more. And sugar was fine as long as you were eating a low-fat diet. The historically fattening carbohydrate was now rebranded as the healthy whole grain. There was little science to support this, but if you did not go along with this diet, then you were ridiculed and ostracized. The food pyramid was created, and how we had eaten for millions of years was turned on its head. Everything was okay to eat as long as it was low in dietary fat. In 1995, the American Heart Association published a pamphlet that stated, to control the amount and kind of fat, saturated fatty acids, and dietary cholesterol you eat, choose snacks from other food groups such as low-fat cookies, low-fat crackers, unsalted pretzels, hard candy, gumdrops, sugar, syrup, honey, jam, jelly, and marmalade. So literally, candy and cake was great for you as long as it was low in fat. So what happened to food consumption after this nutritional mandate? Well, the consumption of high-fat items decreased, and of course, consumption of grains and sugars increased. This is what the government wanted. Fat intake was decreased in the American diet on average from 45% to 35%. At the same time, physicians were instructing patients to smoke less, and rates dropped from 33% to 25%. They instructed them to monitor their blood pressure, and hypertension dropped by 40%. They instructed them to monitor blood cholesterol, and hypercholesterolemia, high cholesterol, dropped by 28%. So people were following health guidelines, despite many arguments to the contrary. And what was the reward? Obesity. So in 1977, the government mandates a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, and the obesity epidemic begins and continues to today. Obesity rates have risen in an unprecedented way and still continue. So what's the answer? Well, according to the World Health Organization, the obesity epidemic is caused by increased intake of foods high in fat and an increase in reduced physical activity. And their answer? Limit intake of total fats and sugars, at least they got that last part right. Increase consumption of fruits, which have sugar, as well as whole grains, the rebranded refined carb. And engage in regular physical exercise. Well, guess what? I did the opposite of that. I stopped exercising and lost and kept off 55 pounds. So how'd I do it? By eating low carb, high fat, and intermittent fasting. How is the WHO ever going to explain that? And with that, we'll end this video. Please subscribe to the channel and remember to click the bell so that you can be sure to get alerts when we upload new videos. You can also get alerts and updates by following us on Facebook and Twitter at Be a Loser Today. And if you like the videos in our series, please click the like button as it does help us out. As always, I thank you for watching, and until next time, keep being a loser.